Welcome back to our video podcast. Steve Autrey from Denver United Methodist Church, along with my almost always companion in this, the Reverend Paul Thompson of Huntersville United Methodist Church. So, Paul, before we get into this week's topics, how is it going, and how's Lent going for you?
Steve, we had a Ash Wednesday service. Probably most of you know we filmed this about a week in advance. So today is actually March 3rd, even though you'll see this on March the 9th. We had an Ash Wednesday service that just was, I think, especially moving. It feels like everybody's starting to feel comfortable enough to come back and be meeting together, and just felt really good for everybody to begin the season of Lent together, obviously with a reminder about our mortality, which is kind of depressing and at the same time also uplifting, because we all know we're going to die. We don't like to think about it. And the good news, of course, is that what God has done for us in Jesus Christ, we never really die. So it felt good yesterday to be together, and I'm hoping it was good at Denver.
Well, since you described yours in such glowing terms, I have to say that ours was probably better.
Of course.
But now everybody here is wishing they'd gone to yours. They're like, oh, you had a good service? But I think we had, our choir did a great job. Can't say much about the preacher, but everything else went pretty well. And again, we used the ashes to just remind us that, ash is what's left after everything else has been burned away. Mm. And when you get to the ashes, there's no ability to reconstitute something. You can take a piece of paper and tear it up into small pieces, and you could painstakingly glue it or tape it back together. But you can't take the ash of something and put it back together. Only God can put us back together, and that's part of Ash Wednesday's message. The other thing I mentioned last night is we take that brokenness, what's left over of the ashes that have no hope, which ashes are a sign of, again, mortality, destruction, ruin, and we add oil to it, which in the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, oil is a sign of healing. Mm. So you mix a sign of healing with a sign of death, with the understanding God brings life, God brings healing to that which has no life otherwise.
Well,
that's the kind of insight people get here.
It is.
And I know you're just sitting there in amazement.
I am. I'm overwhelmed. I don't
I can
know
tell.
what to say. But I hope maybe the message, as we are now in the second week of Lent, I hope that you are taking some time to think about those things that do inhibit life. And I had a fascinating conversation with some of our confirmands last week, and they were telling me how many hours they're spending on things like TikTok type social media. Yeah. And maybe if we are fasting, a fast from some of those kinds of things could actually add to our life, find ways that God might actually be present instead of those TikTok videos.
Well, and that is, there's so many things that consume us. We think we are consumers, but we're actually the ones who are getting consumed. Mm. And also a note about taping these before the fact, because last week when we met, this whole thing with Ukraine was just not even, it hadn't really started, and now it is. So we don't, if you're looking for something that's topical as far as a current event of the day, you're probably not going to find it in our podcast. But we are mindful to remember that has brought home the hurt, suffering of the world in ways that are right on our TV screens. And many people have direct connections to the Ukraine. We will be, the United Methodist Church, our conference has relationships with the United Methodist churches in the Ukraine. Mm. So there is, at least at Denver this week, you'll be hearing about ways that we are going to help partner with the United Methodist Committee on Relief to minister to those who are most vulnerable.
And I know all of our prayers and our hearts are broken, and we join in solidarity with the folks of Ukraine and just pray that God intervenes and changes hearts and minds that only God can do. So we certainly do lift up the people of Ukraine and trust that God is present in the midst of the chaos and brings the certainty that God's presence that can heal and hope.
Right. And with Lent being a season of introspection, that introspection is there to help make us the kind of people who can respond back out to a world in need. I know we're kind of all over the place so far.
Well, it's a good
we're
segue
kind of,
when we start thinking about destruction and war to think about Jerusalem. And that's where kind of the lections for this week, they bring us to that ancient city, that city that is named in some ways the place of peace, but has never really experienced much of that
not much
peace.
peace.
So,
And even if you go to Jerusalem today, it's divided up into different quarters with competing factions. You have, and it is. I mean, it's amazing that there's so much animosity living so close to each other. But the city itself has always been a place of great interest. It's always been a revered holy place for many faiths. But it is a site of conflict.
And so today we're going to begin the conversation for this week with the beginning of that whole conversation about this land, this place called Israel, Canaan, lots of different names for that space. Steve's going to read for us from Genesis the beginning of God making a covenant relationship with a man named Abram, and the beginning of a promise that God makes about that land. Steve, from Genesis?
So we're going to be reading Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 12, and then ending with verses 17 and 18. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, You have given me no offspring, and so a slave born in my house is to be my heir. But the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. No one but your very own issue shall be your heir. He brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, So shall be your descendants. And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you from Ur of the Chaldeans, to give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I shall possess it? He said to him, Bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. He brought him all of these and cut them in two, laying each half over against the other. But he did not cut the birds in two. And when birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell over Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates.
So this whole journey of Abram begins at a place called Haran, down near the mouth of the Arabian Gulf. God says to Abraham, Abram at that time his name, if you'll just go to this place, I'm going to bless you. So Abram begins the journey. He makes the trek north to Ur of the Chaldeans, stops there for a while.
I think it is important to note that Abram wasn't a young man.
And it wasn't even a young man when the journey started, right?
He was kind of older.
Yeah, feeling his oats a little bit.
Just saying.
So he goes to Ur, the Chaldeans, eventually over kind of that Fertile Crescent area. He comes back down into the land that we come to know as the land of Israel. And as he begins to settle in this land, it's never very settled for him. Mm-hmm. And he is struggling. And this scene in which God makes a promise to him is a
yeah, and this is interesting,
scene.
Right? So God says, I will do this for you. And what's Abram's first response?
Well, what good is it going to be? Because I don't even have a descendant.
How he wants proof. Almost like, show me.
Yeah.
There's more give and take in this than we realize. And Abram is like, yeah, but how can this be so? I hear what you're saying, but I don't see it. Yeah, and I wonder, have you ever been there? Right?
I think so many times we experience the absence of God, and we see it as God's no.
Yeah.
Or the silence, and we interpret it as, well, that's not going to happen. And faith and trust is often that key ingredient to patience, to waiting for God to do.
And I would say sometimes we set biblical characters up as to be so otherworldly that we don't think we could have anything close to their same experience. In other words, it's like, yeah, but that was Abraham, or yeah, that was Moses, or yeah, that was King David. Well, when you really pay attention, they are human beings just like me and you. They have their hopes, dreams, but they also have deep doubt at times. And they struggle in how they figure out how to live life with God. And this is certainly the case for Abram in this. He's already been following God, and God's like, hey, God is reiterating the promise. And Abram's like, I've been following you for a while now, and yet, and we're just going to hold on to that yet right there, because I think we're going to pick this story back up tomorrow and continue our podcast there. So read this, pray through it, and ask yourself this question. I hear you, God, yet. What is your yet? Bring that tomorrow, and we'll continue our conversation.
Have a good day.